Okay, so how on earth does a tiny, persecuted sect from a forgotten corner of the Roman Empire become a global religion? If you're picturing some kind of grand, perfectly executed plan, well, the real story is way more surprising. It's a story of accidental missionaries, some really fierce debates, and a grassroots movement that just quietly changed the world. So, let's get into it.
Right, so that's the big question. How did this happen? Seriously, you can just throw out that idea of a perfectly organized mission, with famous apostles fanning out across the globe. The real story? It's much messier, way more surprising, and honestly, a lot more interesting. It didn't start with a plan. Nope. It started with people literally running for their lives. And that leads us right into our first kind of surprising group, the accidental missionaries. And yeah, you heard that right. These were not the famous names you'd recognize from history class. In fact, they weren't trying to start a global movement at all. They were just trying to survive. So, the very first people that actually spread this message were a group called Hellenists. Now, who were they? Well, they were Jewish followers of Jesus who are also pretty open to Greek culture and language. And that cultural flexibility, that's what made the authorities back in Jerusalem really nervous. It made the Hellenists the first targets of persecution, and when they were forced to pack up and run, they unknowingly became the first missionaries. And man, did they scatter. They went everywhere, across Judea, Samaria, and as far out as modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Cyprus. But, and this is a really crucial point, at this super early stage, the sources tell us they were only talking to other Jews. The whole idea of a mission to the rest of the world, it hadn't even really clicked yet. Okay, so that led to the movement's very first, and maybe biggest, identity crisis. The huge question was, could non-Jews, or Gentiles as they were called, join? And if they could, how? This was a massive theological and cultural hurdle they had to figure out, and believe me, it was step by contentious step. So this change didn't happen overnight. It happened in stages. First, you had these encounters with God-fearers. These were non-Jews who were already really drawn to Jewish beliefs. Then you get the big test case, the Apostle Peter, who has this vision and ends up welcoming a Roman centurion named Cornelius. Whoa, that sent absolute shockwaves back to Jerusalem. But the leaders there eventually came around and concluded, this must be part of the plan. And then finally, the Council of Jerusalem makes it official. Gentiles can join, and they don't have to follow all the Jewish laws. This was the moment. This is when the movement pivoted from just a Jewish sect to a potential world religion. Now, let's talk about the mission to the Gentiles. When you think about that, there's usually one name that pops into everyone's head, right? The Apostle Paul. He's often painted as the guy, the single most important figure in Christianity's big expansion. But the historical reality is a little more nuanced than that. Okay, let's break down the myth versus the reality here. The reality is, Paul was absolutely a crucial missionary, but he was not alone, not by a long shot. The New Testament mentions plenty of others, like Barnabas and Apollos, and Paul himself knew he had rivals. Now, his most unique contribution? It wasn't just the crazy number of miles he traveled. It was the letters he wrote. Those epistles, they became scripture and ended up shaping Christian thought for centuries. That gave him an influence that lasted way beyond his actual journeys. And you don't have to take my word for it. Paul himself admits it in his letters. He acknowledges that other missionaries are out there, and some of them are even working out of envy and rivalry. But in the end, he basically says, what does it matter? The important thing is that the message is spreading. This quote is so revealing, isn't it? It shows us a movement that was way bigger and more diverse than just one man's efforts. So you can imagine, this huge influx of non-Jews created a whole new set of challenges. All of a sudden, the movement couldn't just operate as a little sect within Judaism anymore. It had to forge its own identity, with its own structures, its own way of worship, its own way of life, really. First off, they got kicked out of the synagogues, so they started meeting in private homes. But think about it. Converts coming from a pagan background needed to learn the absolute basics, like monotheism and ethics. This led to the creation of something called the catechumenate, which was basically a formal training period for new converts. Even worship itself had to adapt. It got split into two parts, a service of the word that was open for everyone, and then the service of the table, think communion, which was just for baptized members. All right, so what about the OGs, the original apostles, the famous 12? What actually happened to them? Well, this is where it gets tricky. Separating solid, verifiable history from centuries of tradition and legend, that's a real challenge for historians.
Okay, let's really dig into this. For Peter and Paul, we have pretty strong early evidence that they were both martyred in Rome during Nero's persecution. For James, the Bible tells us he was executed in Jerusalem. But for a lot of the others, the stories get, well, a lot less certain. Take the legend that James preached in Spain. That story only showed up centuries later, but it became massively important. Santiago became the patron saint of Spain. And the story of Thomas in India is just fascinating. For a long, long time, historians kind of just dismissed it as a nice story. But then, get this, archaeologists actually found coins proving that the Indian king mentioned in the story, a guy named Gondophares, was a real person. Now, that doesn't prove the story is true, but it definitely makes it a lot harder to just brush aside.
Which brings us right back to our big central question. If this global spread wasn't some centrally planned mission carried out by just a handful of famous apostles, then who was actually responsible for this incredible explosive growth?
And the answer, according to the source material, is both incredibly simple and at the same time pretty profound. The real work was done by thousands and thousands of people whose names we'll never know, the anonymous evangelists.
You see, the Christian faith spread organically, almost like a virus, through the empire's existing networks. It traveled along trade routes with merchants doing business. It moved through households with slaves who were bought and sold. It reached the distant frontiers with soldiers. This wasn't some top-down corporate strategy. It was a grassroots movement, passed from one person to another in the course of their daily lives. Just a truly viral expansion.
So what's the big takeaway here? I think the story of early Christianity really suggests that history is often shaped less by the famous few names we all remember from the textbooks and way more by the collective actions of countless anonymous people. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other great movements in history actually succeeded not because of a single famous leader, but because of the crowd? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.